The whole emergency room stopped breathing the moment Dr. Marcus Hale's open palm connected with Nurse Senna Voss's face. The sound was wrong for a hospital. Too sharp, too loud, too human. 30 people froze where they stood, doctors mid-stride, nurses gripping clipboards, a janitor with a mop handle halfway to the floor. And not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. Because 30 seconds before the slap, Senna Voss had looked the most decorated surgeon at Harlow Creek Medical Center directly in the eye and told him she knew he'd killed a patient on purpose. Now she stood in the middle of Trauma Bay 2, left cheek burning red, clutching a patient file to her chest like it was the only real thing left in the room. "You want to destroy me?" Hale's voice came out low and controlled, which was somehow worse than shouting. "In my hospital? Over a nurse's paranoid little theory?" Senna didn't step back. "I have the records," she said. Quiet. Steady. "I have the logs. And I have the dosage order with your signature on it." His jaw tightened. She held his stare. Around them, nobody breathed. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know I don't tell small stories. But this one kept me up 3 nights writing it, because what happens to Senna Voss inside Harlow Creek Medical Center is the kind of thing that makes you realize how much power one person's silence can cost everyone around them. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss a single part of this, because this story gets darker before it gets just. Drop a like if you're already feeling this, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. Senna Voss had worked the ICU night shift at Harlow Creek Medical Center for 9 years. She wasn't the nurse who organized fundraisers or got her photo taken at hospital galas. She wasn't the nurse who made small talk in the elevator or remembered everyone's birthday. She was the nurse who showed up 7 minutes early, took the hardest patients without being asked, and stayed 40 minutes past the end of her shift when something felt wrong. Because something always felt wrong to Senna, and she'd learned over 9 years that her instincts were usually right. She was also, by almost everyone's accounting, invisible. Not in any unkind way. Just in the way that competent, quiet people become invisible inside institutions built to reward the loud and the credentialed. She did her job. She did it better than most. Nobody talked about her at staff meetings, and nobody talked to her much at parties. And that suited her fine because parties at Harlow Creek meant standing in a circle listening to surgeons congratulate each other. The night everything changed started the way most terrible nights do, with something small that didn't quite fit. She was running a medication check on patients in the ICU's West Wing at 2:14 in the morning, working her way down the board with the focused, slightly mechanical efficiency she'd built up over nearly a decade of overnight shifts, when she reached room 9 and found the IV drip on patient Gerald Morrow, running at a rate that stopped her cold. Gerald Morrow was 63, a retired engineer admitted 4 days earlier for post-surgical monitoring following a routine gallbladder removal. He was progressing well. His morning vitals had been clean. Dr. Marcus Hale had signed off on a discharge plan for Thursday. There was nothing about Gerald Morrow that should have put him anywhere near a crisis. But the medication running into his arm at that moment was not the medication on his chart. Senna set down the tray she was carrying. She checked the label on the bag. She checked it again. She pulled out her phone and photographed it, then photographed the chart, then stood very still in the doorway of room 9 for about 4 seconds while her brain ran through every reasonable explanation. None of them held. The drip running into Gerald Morrow's IV was at a concentration roughly 3 times higher than anything ordered for him. The drug itself was appropriate for a patient in his condition. It was a standard ICU sedative-analgesic combination. But the concentration wasn't. At that level, in a man his size and age with his kidney function, it would suppress his respiratory drive within the hour. Senna crossed to the IV pump, overrode the current infusion, and reduced it to the charted rate before she did anything else. Then she stood beside his bed for a moment, watching his chest rise and fall, and tried to think through what she was looking at. It could have been a pharmacy error. Those happened. Not often, not at this concentration, but they happened. She needed to check the medication log, check who'd last accessed the room, check whether there had been a verbal order she wasn't aware of. She checked. There was no verbal order. There was no pharmacy error notation. What there was, logged into the system at 1:47 a.m. under Dr. Marcus Hale's physician credentials, was a medication adjustment order. The precise adjustment that had changed Gerald Morrow's IV drip to the concentration Senna had just reduced. Marcus Hale had been home for 4 hours. She'd seen him leave herself briefly from the nurse's station. His long coat, his unhurried walk through the glass corridor that connected the ICU to the parking structure. He'd gone home at 9:50 p.m. She'd had no reason to mark the time particularly, but she was the kind of person who noticed things, and it stuck. You couldn't input a medication order from the parking lot. You had to be logged in from a terminal inside the hospital, or from an authorized remote workstation with a verified access token. Senna went to the terminal in the nurse's station and pulled the access log for Dr. Hale's credentials between 9:45 p.m. and 2 a.m. 3 logins, all from Terminal 4C, inside the ICU. But Marcus Hale hadn't come back. She was certain. She'd been at the nurse's station almost continuously. The only way in or out of the ICU after 9 was through the badge-controlled double doors directly in front of her station, and she would have heard them. She would have seen him. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went back and checked Gerald Morrow's chart, his full chart, going back to admission, and she found something else. A previous note from 2 days ago, a medication tolerance assessment, had been modified. Not deleted. Modified. The original entry had flagged a mild concern about renal clearance that would have made higher sedative concentrations a risk factor. The modified version didn't mention renal clearance at all. Somebody had cleaned the chart. Senna photographed everything. She was running on instinct and training and a kind of cold, concentrated dread that she recognized from the one time in her career she'd caught a near miss on a pediatric medication error. That specific feeling of standing on the edge of something that was very, very wrong, and knowing that whatever happened next was going to fall on her either way. She went to the unit supervisor on duty that night, a man named Dale Fisk, who she generally respected, and she told him what she'd found. Quietly. Precisely. With her phone out and her photographs ready. Dale listened. He asked her 2 questions. He looked at her photographs. Then he told her she should go finish her rounds, document her concerns in the standard incident report system, and let the charge physician review it in the morning. It's probably a transcription error on the order entry, he said. It happens. Not at 3 times concentration, she said, and not with chart modifications that match. Senna. He said her name the way people say a name when they want you to hear the conversation that isn't happening. Write it up. Let the morning team handle it. She wrote it up. She also, before she left at 6 a.m., made copies of every document she'd photographed, forwarded them to her personal email from a secured terminal, and wrote out a full handwritten timeline on a notepad she kept in her bag. Gerald Morrow died at 4:17 that morning. The cause listed in his record, cardiac arrhythmia, secondary to post-surgical complications. Senna took 2 days. She wasn't ready to walk into Harlow Creek with an accusation she couldn't fully build yet, and she wasn't willing to walk in at all without something solid enough to survive the first denial. She knew how these things worked. She'd watched other nurses bring smaller complaints and leave without their careers intact. She wasn't going to hand anyone a reason to dismiss her before she'd finished the sentence. She spent those 2 days going through everything she'd collected, cross-referencing it against the incident report she'd filed, which she confirmed had been received, logged, and apparently done nothing further with, and calling 2 people she trusted outside the hospital. Her older brother, who was a pharmacist and could confirm the dosage implications without her having to explain the math, and a former colleague named Petra Samuels who'd left Harlow Creek 2 years earlier and now worked at a county health office. Petra picked up on the second ring. Senna, it's been a while. I know, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly before you think about whether you should. A pause. Okay. When you left Harlow Creek, was it because of something you saw? Another pause, longer this time. I left because the environment was becoming something I didn't want to be part of, Petra said carefully, but I'm not going to say more than that over the phone. Gerald Morrow, Senna said, Room 9, West Wing, admitted last week. She heard Petra inhale. Senna! He's dead. They listed arrhythmia. The line was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to tell you what to do, Petra said finally, but if you have documentation, keep it somewhere they can't reach. Multiple places. And if you walk into that building with an accusation, don't go alone. Senna thanked her and hung up. She didn't have anyone to bring with her. She went alone. The confrontation in Trauma Bay 2 happened because Senna made the mistake of going to administration first, which was the right procedure and the completely wrong decision. She'd requested an urgent meeting with the hospital director's office that morning, been told the director was in meetings until 11, been handed off to an assistant director named Roy Callahan, who listened to her for approximately 6 minutes before picking up his phone, and, she was almost certain, calling Marcus Hale. Within 20 minutes, Hale appeared in the hallway outside Callahan's office. He was calm in that particular way of men who are rarely challenged. His coat was pressed. His ID badge hung straight. He looked at Senna the way you look at a piece of furniture that's in the wrong room. "Nurse Voss," he said, I understand you filed some kind of report." "I filed an incident report 3 days ago," she said. "A patient died. I have documentation of altered records and a medication order entered under your credentials at a time when you were not in the building." Hale tilted his head, a small, almost smile. "You're describing things you don't have the training to interpret accurately." "I have 9 years of ICU nursing," she said. "I know what a medication log looks like, and I know what a chart modification timestamp looks like." "You know what they look like," he said. "You don't know what they mean in context." She looked at him. "Mr. Morrow's renal clearance note was removed," she said. "The one that would have flagged him as high risk for the dosage running in his IV when I found him." Something shifted in Hale's expression then. Something small and quick and gone almost before it registered, and it made her stomach drop because it wasn't guilt exactly. It was something more like adjustment, like a calculation running behind his eyes. "I need you to come with me," he said. "Let's take this conversation somewhere appropriate." She didn't want to go with him, but Callahan was standing there, and there were people in the hallway, and the only alternative was to make a scene right there with nothing resolved, so she followed him. They ended up in Trauma Bay 2 because it was between them and the elevator and it happened to be empty. A coincidence that in retrospect was probably not a coincidence at all. She told him again what she had. She said it directly, without apology, because she was past the point where apology made any sense. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said low and even, "You're lying about me in my own hospital. You think a nurse can destroy what I've built here?" "I don't want to destroy anything," she said. "I want an investigation." "You want attention," he said. "You want to be the one who mattered." That landed somewhere tender, and she hated that it did. "I have the documentation," she said. "I have photographs of the medication bag. I have the access logs. I have—" The slap came without warning. Not a shove, not a grab. An open-handed strike, hard and deliberate, and the sound of it cut through the whole bay like something had broken. Her head turned with the impact. She caught herself against the nearest counter, kept herself upright, and stood there for a moment with the left side of her face blazing and 30 people frozen in the doorways and the hallway outside. The room was completely silent. She turned back to face him. She hadn't dropped the file. Her hand was shaking. She could feel it, but she hadn't dropped it. "I know what you did," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, rough at the edges, but it didn't break. "And I have proof." Marcus Hale looked at her the way you look at something you're not worried about anymore. He straightened his coat. He walked out of the room, and nobody in Trauma Bay 2 said a word. What happened in the following hour was the thing that really shook her, because the slap itself she could process. The slap was assault. The slap was evidence. The slap was, in its way, the kind of mistake that panicked people made, and it told her something about the state of Marcus Hale's confidence that he'd made it in front of 30 witnesses. What she hadn't processed yet was the silence. Not one person in that room came to her, not the nurse standing 6 feet away who she'd worked beside for 3 years, not the resident who'd been right there in the doorway, not the charge nurse who'd trained under Senna in her first year. They stood there, and they looked, and they found somewhere else to be. A woman named Dana Krell, a floor nurse from the cardiology wing who Senna had covered shifts for twice, caught her arm in the hallway outside and squeezed it once. That was all. A squeeze. Then she let go and kept walking. Senna went to the women's restroom on the second floor, ran cold water over her wrists, looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. There was a mark on her cheek. Her eyes were bright and dry. She looked like someone running on something that wasn't quite adrenaline anymore, something older and less clean. She took out her phone. She photographed her own face. Then she called the police non-emergency line, reported the assault, gave them the time and location and witnesses, and was told someone would be in contact within 48 hours. She went back to work. Not because she thought that was the smart thing to do. She went back to work because leaving felt like the first step toward disappearing, and she had patience. And there was a woman in room 14 who'd been confused about her discharge paperwork all morning and hadn't been able to reach her daughter. She finished the shift. The thing about working in a hospital for 9 years is that you learn its rhythms the way you learn a person's, the way a building breathes, the particular quality of silence that settles over the ICU at 3 a.m. versus 3 p.m., which doors close too fast and which ones drag, which lights buzz on the 4th floor. She knew Harlow Creek Medical Center the way some people know a childhood home, not fondly, necessarily, but completely, with the specific intimacy of someone who has spent thousands of hours inside its walls while the rest of the city was asleep. She also knew, in the way that you develop instinct over 9 years, when something had changed. By midday, it had changed. It wasn't anything she could have pointed to cleanly, more of a texture. The way conversation stopped a half-second too quickly when she entered a room. The way 2 administrators she passed in the 3rd-floor corridor both looked at their phones at exactly the same moment when she came around the corner. The way the unit supervisor Dale Fisk stopped by her station at 1 p.m. for no particular reason and stood there a moment making small talk about the weekend before saying, in the same easy tone, "HR wants to meet with you at 3. Just a routine follow-up from the incident this morning." "That was an assault," she said. "Right," Dale said, "which is why they want to talk, just to get your statement." She thought about Petra Samuel's voice on the phone. "If you have documentation, keep it somewhere they can't reach." "I'll be there at 3, she said. She spent the next hour and a half doing 2 things simultaneously. She kept working, checked vitals, updated charts, handled a medication question from the afternoon resident. And she kept moving copies of everything she had to places outside the hospital's reach. She emailed the photographs to an account on a server she'd set up under a different name 2 years earlier, for reasons she'd half forgotten and now felt obscurely grateful for. She sent a text to her brother with an attachment and a message that said, "Hold this. Don't open it unless I ask you to." He replied with a single question mark and then, 30 seconds later, "Okay." At 2:58, she walked into the HR meeting. Roy Callahan was there. So was a woman from hospital legal named Gwen Arlen, who Senna had seen twice at all staff training seminars, and who now looked at her with the polite, managed expression of someone doing a job they've done many times. And across the table, in the chair at the end, sat Marcus Hale. He shouldn't have been there. That was the first wrong thing. An HR investigation into an employee complaint against a physician didn't put the physician in the same room at the same time. That wasn't protocol. That was barely even legal. "Dr. Hale," Senna said, not sitting yet, "this is not standard procedure for a complaint meeting." "This isn't a complaint meeting," Gwen Arlen said pleasantly. "It's a clarification meeting. Please sit down." Senna sat. What followed was 30 minutes of the most carefully constructed language she'd ever experienced outside a courtroom. Nothing accusatory. Nothing directly threatening. A great deal of concern about her well-being, her stress levels, the difficulty of overnight ICU shifts, the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between clinical observation and medical decision-making. A gentle mention that the incident report she had filed had been reviewed and found to contain several factual inaccuracies that would need to be corrected before the report could be properly processed. "What inaccuracies?" she said. Gwen Arlen consulted a paper. "The timestamp discrepancy you noted in Dr. Hale's access credentials has been explained by a system glitch in the terminal logging software that IT has on record from that same evening. The medication discrepancy you noted was the result of a verbal order given to the on-call pharmacist that wasn't entered into the written chart until later, a known documentation gap the pharmacy is working to address." "There was no verbal order," Senna said. "I checked with the on-call pharmacist directly." A brief pause. "The pharmacist on duty that evening has provided a written statement," Gwen said. Senna looked at her, then she looked at Callahan, then, last, she looked at Hale, who was watching her from the end of the table with his hands folded and his expression thoughtful, like a man waiting for a meeting to end. "I'd like a copy of that statement," she said. "That's not something we can provide in this format," Gwen said. "I'd also like to know when the hospital intends to address the physical assault that occurred in Trauma Bay 2 this morning in front of approximately 30 witnesses." The room was quiet. We're taking that matter very seriously, Callahan said. We'd like you to understand that Dr. Hale deeply regrets. He slapped me in the face, Senna said, in a trauma bay, with 30 people watching. What I regret, Marcus Hale said, speaking for the first time since she'd entered the room, his voice measured and tired, like a man burdened by unfortunate necessity, is that this situation has escalated to the point where a valued colleague feels she needs to bring accusations of this nature. Senna. He said her first name quietly. I genuinely like to resolve this. She looked at him. You altered a patient's chart, she said. He died. I have the photographs. You have photographs of standard clinical documentation that you've interpreted outside your area of expertise, he said. I understand why the situation alarmed you. That's the mark of a nurse who cares. But alarm doesn't equal evidence. I want an independent review, she said. External to this hospital, patient records, access logs, medication chain of custody, all of it, an external body. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Gwen Arlen looked at Callahan. Callahan looked at his hands. Marcus Hale uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly. I think what would serve everyone best right now, he said, is a short medical leave. Paid, of course. Give everyone time to work through the proper channels without the pressure of ongoing working relationships. I'm not taking a leave, Senna said. I think you should consider it. I think you should answer for a patient who is dead. The meeting ended 11 minutes later. She walked out with nothing resolved, her incident report flagged for correction, and a mild, bureaucratically phrased suggestion that she speak to the Employee Assistance Program about workplace stress. What she didn't walk out with was any indication of what was already in motion. She found out at 7:14 p.m. when she got back to her apartment and discovered the door was unlocked. She stood in the hallway outside it for a moment. She was almost certain she'd locked it. The deadbolt, the same way she locked it every morning when she left. The knob turned easily under her hand. She pushed the door open from the hall without going in, stood there and looked. The apartment looked almost exactly the way she'd left it. That was the thing. It wasn't ransacked. It wasn't overturned. A person walking in would have thought nothing had changed, except the laptop she'd left open on the kitchen table was closed and moved 4 inches to the right. Except the small stack of papers she'd printed, her personal copies of the medication logs, the one she'd been going to bring to her brother this weekend, were still there, but reordered. She could tell because she'd put the access log sheet on top, and now the incident report was on top. Except the external hard drive she kept in the drawer beside her bed, the one where she'd backed up her phone photographs 2 days ago, was gone. She didn't go into the apartment. She stood in the hallway, her hand on the doorframe, and understood, clearly and completely, the way you understand something when it arrives too loud to misread, that she had stopped being a problem they were managing and started being a threat they were actively working to remove. The phone in her pocket buzzed. She looked down at it. A text from an unknown number. 7 words. They already know where you keep things. She read the text twice. Then she put her phone in her jacket pocket, walked to the stairwell at the end of the hallway, and sat down on the top step with her back against the wall and both hands in her lap, and just breathed for a minute. Not panicking. She wasn't built for panic, or maybe she'd just spent so many years in emergency situations that her body had learned to save it, to hold the panic in reserve for after, for the car ride home, or the shower, or the 3 a.m. ceiling stare. Right now, what she felt was something closer to the particular cold clarity that came when a patient was crashing and there was no attending in the room and she was the most qualified person present. She thought about what she had and what she'd already lost. The hard drive was gone. The printed copies were compromised, touched, reordered, possibly photographed. Her laptop had been accessed. Whatever they'd taken or copied, they now knew the shape of her evidence. They knew what she had, which meant they knew what she didn't have. What she still had. The photographs on her phone, which she'd forwarded to an external account. The email chain with her brother, which lived on a server she controlled. Her own memory, which was detailed and sequential, and not something anyone could walk into her apartment and remove. What she didn't have. A single person inside Harlow Creek Medical Center who had gone on record. She pulled out her phone and called the unknown number back. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. No name, no greeting, just a tone. She hung up. She sat there another minute, listening to the stairwell, the hum of the building's ventilation, a door closing somewhere below, the faint sound of traffic through the fire door at the bottom. Then she stood up, went back to her apartment door, and this time she went in. She moved quickly and methodically. She didn't touch the papers on the table. She went to the bathroom, to the cabinet under the sink, where she kept a waterproof bag she used for camping trips, a habit from the years she'd done river hiking in her late 20s before everything got busy and then stayed busy. And she pulled out the backup phone she kept in there. Old model, different carrier, paid for in cash at a drugstore 18 months ago for reasons she'd told herself were about emergency preparedness and now recognized as instinct. She plugged it in. While it charged, she packed a bag. Not everything, just what she'd grab if she had 20 minutes and needed to be somewhere else. She was out of the apartment in 11 minutes. She didn't go to a hotel. Hotels needed credit cards and credit cards were traceable. She drove to her brother's apartment on the other side of the city. A 40-minute drive she made in 34 because it was late and the roads were clear, and knocked on his door at 8:52 p.m. Nolan Voss answered in a sweatshirt and the specific expression of a man who'd received a cryptic text attachment from his sister and had been quietly worrying about it for several hours. "You look terrible," he said. "I need to use your table," she said, "and I need you to not ask questions for about an hour." He stepped back to let her in. He lasted 22 minutes before asking questions. She told him most of it. Not everything, because there were pieces she was still working out, and she didn't want to hand him information that might put him at risk if someone came asking. But enough that he sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that reminded her of when they were kids, and she'd done something that scared him. "So someone was in your apartment," he said. "Yes." "And they took your hard drive?" "Yes." "And you reported the assault to the police?" "This morning. And the hospital is—" He stopped. "What is the hospital doing exactly?" "Exactly what you'd expect," she said, "protecting the asset." He was quiet for a moment. He was a pharmacist, not a fighter, a careful, precise man who read journals for pleasure and kept a very organized kitchen. And she could see him processing this with the same methodical quality he brought to everything else. "The dosage you described," he said, "what you sent me." "Yes." "That's not ambiguous. That's not something that reads differently in context." He looked at her steadily. "That concentration in a man with his kidney panel, that's a deliberate choice." "I know." "Senna." "I know, Nolan." He got up and made coffee, which was how he handled things that were too large to sit still with, and she used the time to open her laptop, the personal one she'd brought, different from the one in the apartment, and start reconstructing the documentation from memory and from the email records she still had access to. She worked until almost 1 in the morning. She slept on Nolan's couch for 5 hours and woke up already thinking. The text from the unknown number bothered her. Not because it was threatening, though it was, but because of what it implied. They already know where you keep things. That wasn't information you'd send to frighten someone unless you wanted them to know. The search had already happened. Which meant whoever sent it wasn't the same person who'd ordered the search. Someone was watching the people who were watching her and thought she should know. She held that thought. She didn't know what to do with it yet, so she set it aside. She called the police non-emergency line at 8 a.m. to follow up on the assault report. She was transferred twice and then told by a clerk that the report was on file and an officer would be in contact. She asked for a case number. After a pause, she was given one. Then she drove to Harlow Creek. She knew going back was probably what they expected. She also didn't have any good alternative. She had a shift. She had patience. And there was something in her, not bravado, not exactly, something more reflexive than that resisted the idea of staying away. She got to the ICU at 6:42 a.m., 7 minutes before her shift started, the same as always. Dale Fisk was waiting at the nurse's station. He had the look of someone who'd been asked to do something he didn't enjoy. She recognized it because she'd seen Dale in a lot of situations over 9 years, and this wasn't his normal expression. His normal expression was mild, distracted, perpetually managing 15 things. This was something contracted and careful. "Senna," he said. "Can you come with me?" "My shift starts in 7 minutes," she said. "I know, this won't take long." It took 20 minutes, which was how long the hospital director, a man named Victor Strell, needed to read her the prepared statement he'd clearly had in front of him before she arrived. Victor Strell was 61, silver-haired, and had the measured public address quality of someone who'd spent 3 decades in hospital administration and learned to make every sentence sound like a press release. The termination was for professional misconduct, unauthorized access of confidential patient records, harassment of medical staff, and willful violation of hospital information security protocol. She was to surrender her badge immediately. Security would escort her to collect personal items from her locker. Her final paycheck would be processed within the standard window. The hospital wished her well. She sat across the desk from Victor Strel and listened to all of it without interrupting, which she could tell surprised him. He'd probably expected tears, or anger, or the kind of desperate negotiation that people sometimes fell into when they realized something irreversible was happening. She didn't feel any of those things, or rather she felt all of them somewhere underneath, distant and cued. But what she felt on top was a very particular kind of stillness that she'd noticed in herself before in bad situations. The stillness of someone who has already decided what comes next. The records I accessed were those of my own patients during the course of patient care, she said, when he finished. That's not unauthorized access, that's nursing. The specific exports and duplications you performed fall outside standard clinical documentation, he said. I performed them because I had reasonable grounds to believe a patient was at risk. That belief, he said very carefully, was not supported by the clinical evidence. She looked at him. Mr. Strel, a patient is dead. I documented a medication discrepancy and a chart modification. I was physically assaulted by the attending physician in a room full of witnesses, and your response to that sequence of events is to fire me. Our response to your conduct, he said, equally carefully, is the action I've described. We wish you well, Senna. She surrendered her badge. She followed the security officer, a young man named Perry, who she'd had friendly conversations with for 3 years, and who now looked at the middle distance and not at her, to her locker. She put her spare shoes and her mug and the paperback she'd been reading into a plastic bag. She walked out through the main entrance. The morning air outside was cold and bright in the particular way of late autumn, when the light comes in at an angle and makes everything look sharper and a little merciless. She sat in her car for a moment. Then she drove. She didn't surrender. That's the thing that would be easy to misread about the next several days. She wasn't recovering or retreating or taking stock. She was building. The first thing she did was find a lawyer. Not the kind you find by searching online. She'd asked Petra Samuels, who'd given her a name, a labor and medical litigation attorney named Dolores Pack, who operated out of a small office in the west side of the city, and who had, Petra said, a specific record with hospital cases. Dolores Pack was 54, small, and talked fast in the way of someone who'd learned that slowing down cost her more than it bought. Walk me through it, she said, chronologically. Don't interpret, just tell me what happened in the order it happened. Senna walked her through it. Dolores Pack took notes by hand. She didn't interrupt. When Senna finished, she tapped her pen on the page twice and said, The assault is your strongest immediate card. You have a case number. I do. And you have witnesses. About 30 of them. Of which, Dolores said, how many do you expect to actually testify? The silence that followed was answer enough. Right. Dolores looked at her notes. The medication documentation. You said you forwarded photographs to an external email before the access to your apartment. Yes. So you have those. I do. The chart modification. Can you show the original note versus the modified version? I photographed the modification timestamp. I can show it existed and show the content change. But you can't access the system anymore to pull the actual audit trail. No. Dolores clicked her pen. I'm going to need to file for emergency records preservation before they get scrubbed. That's today, not tomorrow. She looked up. I also need you to understand something. This case is going to get uglier before it gets better. When I file, they will respond, and they have more resources than you do. I know that, Senna said. Do you have somewhere to stay that isn't your apartment? Yes. Keep it that way for now. Dolores was already writing, and if anyone contacts you from the hospital, HR, administration, anyone on staff, you don't respond. You give them my number. What about my colleagues? Dolores looked up. Nobody inside that hospital, she said, until I tell you otherwise. Senna nodded. It was the right advice. She knew it was the right advice. She also knew she was already thinking about the one exception, the reason she'd been turning over in the back of her mind for 2 days. the thread that felt thin but real. What? Her name was Jory Toll. She was 26, 8 months into her first ICU nursing job, and she had the quality that good new nurses sometimes had of noticing everything and saying nothing because she hadn't yet figured out how much trouble noticing things could get you into. Senna had trained her on nights. Not formally. Harlow Creek's official orientation program was run by someone in education, but in the practical sense of showing her how the West Wing actually worked at 3 a.m., which equipment was temperamental, which attending preferences weren't written down anywhere. Jory was serious and a little nervous and smarter than she let on, and she'd started leaving small notes in the break room for Senna when she had questions she didn't want to ask out loud, which Senna had found both touching and, at the time, faintly amusing. She didn't contact Jory directly. She sent a text from the backup phone, a number Jory had never seen, to the personal email address she knew from the shift scheduling system, a contact Senna technically shouldn't have had access to, but had copied down 8 months ago for a coverage emergency and never deleted. The text said, "Coffee, outside, not hospital. Let me know if that's possible. Don't reply to this number. Use the email above." She waited. 4 hours later, the email came back. One line, "Tomorrow, 7 a.m., Dalloway's on Fremont." Yeah. Dalloway's was a coffee shop 2 miles from the hospital that was too small and too far off the parking grid to attract much medical center traffic. Senna arrived first and took the table in the back corner and ordered a drip coffee she didn't particularly want. Jory came in at 7:04, still in the compression socks she wore under scrubs, which meant she'd come straight from the end of her shift. She looked exhausted and wary in equal measure, the way people looked when they knew a conversation was going to cost them something. She sat down without taking off her jacket. "I only have 20 minutes, she said. "That's enough." Jory looked at her carefully. "You look—" She stopped. Started again. "Everyone's saying you fabricated it, the whole thing." "What do you think?" Senna said. Jory was quiet for a moment. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug that had appeared in front of her and looked at the table. "I think," she said slowly, "that the night before Mr. Morrow died, I was doing my end-of-shift walkthrough at 1:30, and I saw the light on in the terminal alcove near 4C, which I thought was weird because the alcove is usually dark when nobody's in there." Senna kept her face even. "Did you see who was using the terminal?" she said. "I didn't go in." Jory looked up. "I should have, but it was late, and I figured it was just someone charting, and I didn't think about it until the next day when I heard about Mr. Morrow, and then I just—" She stopped. "I didn't want to think about it." "Okay." "I don't know what I actually saw," Jory said. "I saw a light on, that's all." "That's something," Senna said. "It's not much." "No, but it's something." Jory looked at her for a long moment. There was something moving behind her eyes. Not courage exactly, because courage would have been easier, but the harder, less heroic thing of someone trying to figure out how much the truth was going to cost them. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to keep building what I have until I have enough," Senna said. "I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm not asking you to sign anything or talk to anyone. I just needed to know if I was alone in what I saw." Jory looked at her coffee. "You're not alone," she said quietly, "but I can't say that louder than this. Not yet." "I know." They sat with that for a moment. "Be careful," Senna said. "Don't ask questions about it at work. Don't look anything up on hospital systems. Just keep your head down and pay attention. That's all." Jory nodded. She stood up and picked up her bag. She stopped at the edge of the table. "He did it, didn't he?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Senna looked at her. "Yes," she said. "He did." Jory left without saying anything else. Dolores Pack filed the emergency records preservation motion that afternoon. By the following morning, it had been answered, not by the hospital directly, but through their legal firm, a large and fast-moving outfit whose first correspondence was a 9-page document that Dolores summarized in one sentence. "They're going to claim you stole the records you're asking them to preserve." Senna read that sentence and sat with it. "They reported me," she said. "To the state nursing board, yes, and potentially to the police. Unauthorized access to confidential patient data. The photographs you took on hospital premises using hospital systems. I took them on my personal phone, which you then used to email documents containing protected health information to a personal server. There's a legal argument there, and they're going to make it. Dolores set down the document. I want you to understand that this is a common move. When institutions face this kind of exposure, the first response is to shift the legal narrative. Make the person who found the problem into the problem. It's not subtle, but it's effective. How effective? Senna said. Dolores looked at her. Effective enough that I've seen cases with strong evidence collapse because the plaintiff ran out of money for legal fees before the institution ran out of institutional lawyers. I don't have a lot of money. I know. I took this case because I think it's real, but I need you to understand what you're in. Senna understood. She sat across from Dolores in that small West Side office with the afternoon light coming in sideways and the sound of the city outside and tried to take an honest accounting of where she was. She had photographs of a medication discrepancy. A modification timestamp showing a patient record had been altered. The access log she'd photographed showing Hale's credentials active on a terminal when he wasn't in the building. Her own incident report, filed and apparently suppressed. A police report for assault, filed and apparently stalled. One new nurse who'd seen a light on in an alcove. Against the full legal resources of Harlow Creek Medical Center. A pharmacist who'd apparently provided a written statement she hadn't seen. A fabricated explanation for the access log discrepancy. A nursing board complaint that, if it proceeded, could cost her her license while the case played out. And someone who'd been inside her apartment and taken her hard drive. She thought about that last piece. About the text message. They already know where you keep things. Which meant someone inside the circle of people protecting Hale had either sent that warning or was responsible for triggering it. Either way, there was a fracture. Small, maybe, but real. She drove home to Nolan's that evening and ate the dinner he'd made without tasting much of it, and then sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and started working through something she'd been turning over for days. The patients. Not Gerald Morrow specifically. All of them. She had access to some public records, death notices, briefcase summaries from the hospital's own quality reports, which were filed quarterly with the state health authority and available online. She started pulling them, cross-referencing dates, looking at the overlap with Hale's surgical calendar, which had been included in a hospital publication from the previous year that had gone online as part of a physician spotlight series. It took her 4 hours and 2 false starts and several wrong assumptions she had to back out of. But at 11:47 p.m., she found something. 3 patients in the previous 18 months. 3 deaths that the hospital had listed as post-surgical complications in Hale's caseload. 3 people who were not particularly connected on the surface, except they were all connected to a class action lawsuit that had been filed against the hospital 14 months ago. Fraud, financial. Specifically, an allegation that Harlow Creek Medical Center had been systematically overbilling insurance providers for procedures over a 6-year period, a scheme detailed in a lawsuit that had somehow never made it to trial. She stared at the connection for a long time. Then she searched the names of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit. Gerald Morrow's name wasn't on the plaintiff list, but his brother-in-law's was. She sat back in the chair and felt something cold and clear settle over her, the way it settled when a clinical picture came together and you wished it hadn't. These weren't random patients who'd triggered something inconvenient. These were people who were connected to the case that could unravel Harlow Creek's finances. The fraud scheme was the engine. The murders were the maintenance. She needed more than this. She knew she needed more than this. She also knew, for the first time since the slap in Trauma Bay 2, exactly what she was fighting. She was saving the document to her encrypted backup when her phone rang. The backup phone, not her regular one. The number she'd given only to Jory. She answered it. Silence on the line, then a voice that wasn't Jory's, lower, older, a woman's voice with a specific controlled tension. Ms. Voss, the voice said, I'm going to need you to listen very carefully because I'm not going to be able to say this twice and I'm not calling from a number that will exist after tonight. Senna pressed the phone to her ear. I'm listening. Gerald Morrow wasn't the first, the voice said. He was the 4th, and the next one is already scheduled. The line went dead. Senna sat there with the phone in her hand, the kitchen quiet around her, the city outside the window doing whatever it did at midnight, and understood that whatever she'd been building toward had just changed shape completely. Somewhere in Harlow Creek Medical Center, a patient was sleeping in a bed they didn't know was already compromised, and the person who'd just called her had hung up before she could ask a single question. She didn't sleep. She sat at Nolan's kitchen table with the backup phone face up in front of her and went through it the way she went through everything, methodically, without rushing, because rushing was how you missed things, and she couldn't afford to miss anything right now. The voice on the phone had been controlled, not panicked. Someone who'd thought about making that call before making it, who'd chosen every word, who'd hung up the moment the essential information was delivered. That wasn't someone acting impulsively. That was someone managing risk. The next one is already scheduled. She turned that sentence over. Scheduled meant a procedure or a medication protocol or a discharge plan, something with a date on it, something that existed in the hospital's systems right now that she had no way to access. She picked up her regular phone and called Dolores. It was 12:40 in the morning. Dolores answered on the third ring, which told Senna either the woman didn't sleep much or had been expecting this call. "Someone contacted me," Senna said. "Anonymous. They told me there's another patient at risk, currently inside Harlow Creek." A pause. "Did they give you a name?" Dolores said. "No, they hung up." Description of the voice. Female, older, calm, not hospital staff, I don't think. The cadence was different, more deliberate. Could be a former employee, could be someone connected to a prior case. Dolores was already moving through it. "Did they give you any indication of timeline?" "No, just that it's scheduled." "Okay." A long breath. "I'm going to make some calls in the morning. There's a state health authority contact I've used before. If we can get a flag on Harlow Creek's current surgical schedule, trigger a review, it buys time without us having to show everything we have yet." "How long does that take?" Senna said. "Longer than tonight." That was the answer she'd expected and didn't want. She thought for a moment. "The lawsuit," she said. "The insurance fraud case from 14 months ago. Who filed it?" "I don't know off the top of my head why. Because I think that's what connects the patients. Not medical profiles, not demographics. They're all connected, directly or through family, to the plaintiffs in that case." The silence on Dolores's end shifted quality. "Send me what you have," she said. "Tonight. I'll look at it first thing." Senna sent everything. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about a patient somewhere in Harlow Creek Medical Center, sleeping without knowing that someone had already decided the date of their death. And she felt something that wasn't quite fear. It was more immediate than fear, more specific. The feeling of a clock running. She didn't sleep. She researched. By 4 a.m., she had a partial picture of the fraud case. The suit had been filed by a group of 11 plaintiffs, patients and former patients of Harlow Creek, who alleged that the hospital had systematically billed their insurance providers for procedures that were either unnecessary, never performed, or inflated beyond what was clinically indicated. The suit had been significant enough to attract a specialist law firm from outside the city, and it had been moving, slowly, the way these cases always moved, toward a discovery phase when it suddenly settled out of court 8 months ago. The settlement terms were sealed. 3 of the 11 plaintiffs had died in the preceding 6 months. All 3 deaths had occurred inside Harlow Creek Medical Center. All 3 had been listed as complications. Gerald Morrow's brother-in-law, a man named Thomas Rue, was plaintiff number 7. He was still alive, as far as Senna could determine. He lived 40 minutes outside the city. She wrote down his name. The other 7 surviving plaintiffs were harder to trace. 4 she could find by cross-referencing the public court filing with online records, obituaries, property records, LinkedIn pages. 2 of those 4 had been readmitted to Harlow Creek in the past 3 months for unrelated complaints. She stared at that for a long time. Then she pulled up Dolores's email and added the plaintiff analysis to what she'd already sent, flagged it urgent, and closed the laptop. The sun was starting to suggest itself at the edges of the sky outside Nolan's window. She could hear him moving around in his bedroom. He had an early shift himself, a pharmacist shift that started at 7, and he'd been trying not to wake her. She got up and made coffee, and when he came out of the bedroom already dressed, he looked at her face and then at the coffee and said, "You didn't sleep." "No." "Senna, there's another patient at risk," she said, "inside the hospital, tonight." He sat down. She gave him the condensed version. He listened with the focused stillness of someone absorbing something they don't want to be true. "You have to go to the police," he said. "I went to the police. I have a case number for the assault that nobody's followed up on. This is different. This is a credible threat, based on an anonymous phone call to a backup number that no longer exists." She looked at him steadily. Nolan, I know you want me to hand this to someone else. I want to hand it to someone else. But what I have right now is not enough to move an institution. Not fast enough. He was quiet. So what are you going to do? He said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I'm going to find out who's next, she said. She needed someone inside the hospital, not Jory. Jory was too exposed, too visible, and Senna had already asked more of her than was fair. She needed someone with system access who wasn't in Hale's orbit, someone who had reason to want the truth out, and hadn't yet decided what that reason was worth. She thought about the people she'd worked with for 9 years and applied the filter ruthlessly. Who would help? Who was too afraid? Who was too connected to administration? Who was too close to Hale's team? She went through 20 names in her head and discarded 17 of them. The 3 she kept: a biomedical technician named Stu Waverly, who'd complained for years about how the hospital handled equipment documentation and who had access to system logs she didn't. A records coordinator named Bev Okafor, who'd once, in the break room, said something blunt and direct about administration's ethics that had made Senna laugh and then immediately look around to see if anyone had heard. And a night shift pharmacist named Dale, not the supervisor Dale, but a different Dale, Dale Renfro, who'd been at Harlow Creek for 6 years and who Senna had noticed, small detail, took photographs of medication labels with his personal phone before processing unusual orders, a habit he'd never explained, and that she'd always read as the habit of someone who had once been blamed for something that wasn't his fault. She ruled out Stu first. His access was too narrow and his position too vulnerable. She thought hard about Bev and then set her aside too, because Bev had 2 kids in middle school and a mortgage, and the calculation wasn't the same for everyone. That left Dale Renfro. She sent him a message through an intermediary, a mutual contact she trusted, a retired nurse named Margot Sills, who still had warm relationships with half the hospital, and who she called at 7:30 in the morning on the grounds that Margot was 71 and had been up for 2 hours already. I need to pass a message, Senna said, to someone at the hospital, discreetly. Tell me who, Margot said, without particular surprise. 40 minutes later, Margot called back. He says he'll meet you, noon. He picks the place. The place Dale Renfro picked was a park bench beside a dog-walking path 1.5 miles from the hospital, which suggested he'd thought about surveillance radius and civilian traffic cover, which suggested he was smarter about this than his job title implied. He was already sitting when she got there, a compact man in his early 40s in a zip-up fleece, feeding pieces of a granola bar to a pigeon that was spectacularly unimpressed by the offering. You know they're going to assume I talked to you, he said, not looking up. Just by me being here. Do you care? She said. Ask me again in 10 minutes. He finally looked at her. His eyes were careful. Margot says you need something from pharmacy records. I need to know if there's a patient currently scheduled for a procedure or protocol that involves Marcus Hale in the next 48 to 72 hours, who is connected to the Harlow Creek insurance fraud lawsuit. The pigeon lost interest and walked away. Dale watched it go. That's specific, he said. I have reason to believe a patient is at risk. I'm not being dramatic. I know you're not. He said it simply, like it was a fact he'd already made his peace with. I've been watching Hale's medication orders for 8 months. He paused. Not officially. Watching. What did you see? She said. Orders that didn't make clinical sense at the concentrations listed. Orders that came through the system at odd hours. A couple of times, orders that I flagged for confirmation and then found the confirmation record in the system the next morning, signed off by the on-call physician. Except the on-call physician that night had no memory of confirming anything. You kept records of this, she said. I photograph everything before I process anything that looks off. He looked at her sideways. Habit. I know, she said. I noticed. He was quiet for a moment. What happened tomorrow wasn't the first time I felt wrong about an order, he said. It was just the first time someone else was already looking. She told him what she needed. Not everything. She wasn't going to hand him the full picture and let him decide whether to run with it or run from it. Just the specific ask. Access to the scheduling system and the current medication protocol queue for Hale's active patients, cross-referenced against any name that appeared in the public court filings from the fraud lawsuit. I can't pull that from outside the building, he said. I'd have to be logged in. You're on shift tonight, she said. It wasn't a question. Margot had checked. I am. Can you do it then? He looked at the empty bench slats where the pigeon had been. He looked like someone doing math that kept coming out to a number he didn't like. "If I find something," he said, "what do you do with it?" "I stop it," she said. He looked at her. "I mean that literally," she said. "If there's a patient scheduled to receive an altered protocol, I need to know who they are and when, and I need enough time to get someone authorized into that room." "You're not authorized anymore." "No, but my lawyer can get an emergency court order if I bring her a name and a timeline, and I have a contact at the state health authority." Dolores had mentioned the contact. Senna was pulling it forward now as if it were more solid than it was, because sometimes the difference between convincing someone and losing them was 2 degrees of confidence. Dale Renfro stood up. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked out at the dog-walking path where a woman was currently losing an argument with a beagle about whether the walk was over. "I'll call you tonight," he said. "If I find something, I'll call the number Margot gave me." He walked away. She sat on the bench and looked at her phone and thought, this is the part where it either opens or it doesn't. She spent the afternoon with Dolores going through the plaintiff analysis, mapping the deaths against dates, and building what Dolores called a disclosure package, a structured presentation of everything Senna had, organized for maximum clarity for the kind of person who would receive it with initial skepticism. The state health authority contact was real. Dolores called her while Senna was in the office, a woman named Iris Vander who worked in the medical oversight division and who listened without comment for 4 minutes before saying she needed something in writing before she could initiate anything. "How fast?" Dolores said. "If it's compelling, 48 hours for a preliminary review flag." "We may not have 48 hours. "Then give me something I can move faster on," Iris Vander said. "A specific, named, current risk, not a pattern. A patient." Dolores looked at Senna across the desk. "Working on it," Senna said. She drove back to Nolan's and waited. At 10:47 p.m., her backup phone rang. "It's me," Dale said. He was speaking quietly. She could hear the ambient sound of the pharmacy behind him, the hum of refrigeration units, the distant PA system. "I found something." She pressed the phone hard against her ear. "Patient name is Renata Fowler," he said. 67. Admitted 4 days ago for a cardiac workup. She's scheduled for a stress test protocol tomorrow morning starting at 9. Low-risk procedure, standard stuff. But there's a medication pre-protocol on her chart, ordered tonight under Hale's credentials, that I've never seen listed for that procedure. "What's the medication?" He told her. She knew it. She knew exactly what it was. An antiarrhythmic used correctly in specific post-procedure contexts, but in a patient with the cardiac presentation, Renata Fowler's chart would likely show, at the concentration Dale was reading to her, it would suppress her cardiac response during the stress test and make the resulting arrhythmia look like a natural complication of a pre-existing condition. It was elegant. That was the terrible thing. It was medically elegant in the way that made it almost invisible. "Is her name in the lawsuit filings?" Senna said. "I looked," Dale said. "Her name isn't on the plaintiff list, but her daughter is. Fowler, Renata E. is listed as an emergency contact." A pause. "Her daughter, Greta Fowler, is plaintiff number 9. Senna was already standing. "Dale," she said, "you need to flag that medication order, right now tonight. Standard protocol. Query the prescribing physician for confirmation of the indication. If I flag it, it'll come back confirmed by morning. It always does." "I know, but it creates a documented record of the query, and it buys time." She was pulling her jacket on one-handed. "And then I need you to do one more thing." "What?" "Write down everything you told me just now, time-stamped, and send it to this email." She gave him the address. "Before you leave that building tonight." A pause. "Okay," he said. Then, "Senna, be careful what you walk into." She was already out the door. She called Dolores from the car. Dolores picked up immediately, which meant she'd been waiting too. "Renata Fowler," Senna said. "Patient at Harlow Creek Cardiac Unit. Pre-procedure protocol ordered tonight under Hale's credentials. Stress test at 9 a.m. She read off the medication and concentration from what Dale had told her. "Her daughter is plaintiff 9 in the fraud lawsuit." Dolores was already typing. "I'm calling Iris Vander." "Tonight?" "I'm calling her right now. This is specific. This is named. This is a timeline." Her voice was controlled but fast. "Where are you going?" I need to get into that hospital. Senna, I'm not going to do anything that gets us thrown out of court, she said. But I need to be there. I need to see what happens when that protocol gets queried, and I need someone in that building who knows what they're looking at. You're terminated. You can't enter as staff. I can enter as a visitor, she said. Visiting hours run until 11. It was 11:03 p.m. She drove anyway. The parking structure at Harlow Creek was half empty at this hour. She pulled in at the visitor level, found a spot, and sat for a moment looking at the building's lit-up upper floors. The ICU was up there, the cardiac unit 2 floors below it, the pharmacy at ground level in the east wing. She knew this building's rhythms in the dark. She'd lived them. She got out of the car. The main entrance was closed at 11. The ER entrance was open around the clock. She went in through the ER, past a waiting room that held 6 people in various states of the specific misery that brought people to emergency rooms at midnight, past the triage desk where a nurse she didn't know glanced at her briefly and then looked back at a monitor. She took the stairs. The cardiac unit was on the 3rd floor, south wing, a ward she'd floated to 3 times in 9 years and knew well enough to navigate without looking lost. She moved through the hallway at the pace of someone who belonged. Not fast, not slow. The particular purposeful neutrality that healthcare workers wore as natural camouflage. Room 312 was Renata Fowler. The door was partially open. She stopped at the edge of the doorway and looked in without crossing the threshold. Renata Fowler was asleep. A small woman, silver hair spread on the pillow, one arm resting outside the blanket with an IV line running into the back of her hand. The monitors beside her bed showed normal sinus rhythm, unremarkable. She looked like somebody's grandmother, which she was, and she looked like someone who had no idea that her daughter's involvement in a lawsuit had put a target on her chart. The IV bag above her bed was standard saline. The pre-protocol medication Dale had flagged wasn't scheduled until 7 a.m., a standing order to be administered before the stress test. That gave her approximately 7 hours. She stepped back from the doorway. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dolores. Iris Vander is making calls. She needs the medication order documentation. Can your pharmacy source send it directly? Senna forwarded Dale's email the moment it came through, which was 4 minutes later, timed 11:19 p.m., detailed and specific and clearly written by someone who knew exactly how to document a pharmacy query in language that would survive legal scrutiny. She forwarded it to Dolores. She added, Hale's credentials used again after hours. Pattern consistent with previous incidents. Patient at room 312 cardiac unit. She was standing in the stairwell sending the message when she heard the door above her open. Footsteps on the stairs. Coming down. She didn't think. She moved, pushing through the door to the 2nd floor landing and letting it close behind her without sound, pressing herself against the wall beside it, listening. The footsteps passed the 2nd floor door and kept going down. She stayed where she was. Through the narrow window in the stairwell door, she could see a section of the 2nd floor hallway. A passing cart. A light above a nursing station. And then, walking across her line of sight at the far end of the hall, in street clothes, not a white coat, which was why she almost didn't register it at first, Marcus Hale. In the hospital. At 11:23 p.m., she pressed her back flat against the wall and thought very clearly about what she was seeing and what it meant and what she needed to do in the next 30 seconds. He was here. He was in the building, after hours, in street clothes, and Renata Fowler's pre-protocol medication was sitting as a standing order in the system that he'd placed there under his own credentials tonight. She pulled out her phone and called Dolores. He's here, she said, as soon as Dolores picked up. Hale is in the building right now, 2nd floor, heading... She pressed close to the window again. He was moving in the direction of the south stairwell. 3rd floor access. Cardiac unit. He's moving toward the cardiac unit. Senna, do not engage with him. I need you to call Iris Vander right now and tell her we are past the 48-hour window. Tell her if someone isn't in that building tonight, we're not going to have a patient to protect by morning. I hear you. Dolores, right now. She hung up. She went back to the stairwell. She went up. The cardiac unit at night ran on a skeleton crew. 2 nurses covering the full ward, 1 aide, an on-call physician down the hall, who was usually asleep in the call room unless someone's vitals alarmed. Senna knew this because she'd floated here and because the geography of nighttime hospitals was something she understood in her body. She came through the stairwell door to the third floor and moved toward the south wing without running, because running was what made people stop you. She came around the corner to the cardiac ward and found Jory Toll standing at the nurse's station. Both of them stopped. Jory's eyes went wide. Then she looked past Senna down the hallway, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, but a particular quality of recognition. "He came through here 2 minutes ago," Jory said, very quietly. "Dr. Hale. He went to the medication prep room." "Which direction?" Senna said. Jory pointed. The medication prep room was at the far end of the ward, a small room where nurses drew up medications for administration. Not a secure area exactly, but not a place a physician would normally have any business being at 11 p.m. "Did anyone stop him?" Senna said. "The charge nurse. She asked if she could help him, and he said he was reviewing a patient protocol." Jory's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "Senna, if he goes into room 312, is there a camera on the medication prep room?" "There's one in the hallway outside it." "Who monitors it?" "Security. Main desk." Senna thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Call security right now," she said. "Tell them you have an unauthorized after-hours medication access in progress, and you need someone on the floor immediately. Don't use Hale's name yet, just the room and the time. They'll ask who I am. Tell them." Senna was already moving. "You're the nurse on duty, and you're reporting an active concern. That's your job." She heard Jory reaching for the phone as she walked. The hallway to the medication prep room was 30 feet long. She was 10 feet from the door when it opened. Marcus Hale stepped out. He was holding nothing, both hands visible, empty, coat folded over one arm. He looked like a physician who had been reviewing a chart and was now done reviewing it. He looked at her. The expression on his face did something she hadn't seen before, something that wasn't the calm management of a powerful man encountering a minor inconvenience, something faster and harder and less controlled. "How are you in this building?" he said. "I walked in," she said. He looked past her down the hallway. She could hear footsteps coming from the direction of the nurse's station, the on-duty nurse, or Jory, or both. "Whatever you think you just prevented," he said, low and very even, "you're wrong." "Tell that to Renata Fowler," she said. His jaw tightened. "She's a patient in need of care," he said. "That's all she is." "Her daughter is Plaintiff 9, Senna said. "And I have the medication order you placed tonight, the timestamp, and a pharmacist's documentation of a query that you haven't answered yet." Something moved behind his eyes. And then, behind Senna, the elevator at the end of the hallway opened. She turned. 2 people she didn't recognize, a man and a woman, both in business clothes, both with the specific posture of people who carried authority, as a matter of course, walked out of the elevator. The woman was already showing identification to the security officer who'd responded to Jory's call, and was now standing at the end of the hall, looking uncertain about who he was supposed to be managing. The woman looked at the security officer, then past him at the hallway, then at Senna, then at Marcus Hale. "Dr. Marcus Hale," she said. Her voice was level and carried. "I'm Special Agent Cara Delmont, State Health Authority, Criminal Investigation Division. I need you to come with me." The hallway was very quiet. Hale looked at the agent. He looked at Senna. And for the first time in everything, in all of it, the slap in Trauma Bay 2, the HR meeting, the apartment, the termination, all of it, she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation or contempt or managed authority. She saw him understand that he had run out of moves. "Dr. Hale," Agent Delmont said again. "Now, please." He moved toward her. And as he passed Senna in the hallway, close enough that she could hear him breathe, he said nothing. He didn't look at her. He moved past her like she wasn't there, the last refuge of a man who had spent his career treating her as invisible. But the agents were there. Jory was there. The security camera above the medication prep room was there. And in room 312, Renata Fowler slept through all of it, her monitors showing a steady, uninterrupted rhythm, her IV drip running exactly as it should, the standing medication order still sitting in the system, flagged, queried, undispersed, and now part of an evidence trail that would take weeks to fully process and months to fully understand. Senna stood in the hallway and watched them walk Marcus Hale to the elevator. Agent Delmont's partner, a younger man with a tablet already out, stopped beside her briefly. "Are you Senna Voss?" he said. "Yes," she said. We're going to need a full statement, he said. Tonight, if possible. I know, she said. I've been building it for a week. He nodded and moved on. She stood there alone in the hallway of the cardiac unit at 11:41 p.m. and felt the specific, unglamorous, almost anticlimactic quality of a thing that had finally broken open. Not a triumph, not yet, not by a long way, but the particular sensation of a door that had been locked from the outside finally giving. From down the hall, Jory appeared at the edge of the nurses' station. She looked at Senna. She didn't say anything. Senna's phone rang. It was Dolores. Tell me what's happening, Dolores said. They're here, Senna said. They've got him. Is the patient safe? For tonight, Senna said. Yes. A long breath from Dolores. Okay, don't talk to anyone without me on the line. Not the agents, not the hospital. There's something else, Senna said. What? She was looking at the medication prep room door, still closed. She thought about what Hale had said. Whatever you think you just prevented, you're wrong. And the specific quality of a man who said a thing like that when he had nothing left to threaten with. The agents are here because of the patient, she said, because of tonight. But Hale knew they were coming. How? He came anyway, she said. He came here anyway, Dolores, knowing I was building a case, knowing the health authority was involved. He came here tonight anyway and walked into this ward. The silence on the line stretched. Either he's more reckless than we thought, Dolores said carefully. Or he wasn't here for Renata Fowler, Senna said. The elevator at the end of the hall opened again. 2 more people stepped out. Not agents this time, hospital administration. Roy Callahan and a woman from legal, both of them moving fast with the particular tension of people responding to a crisis they'd been notified of 3 minutes ago. Callahan saw Senna. He stopped. And behind him, stepping out of the elevator last, was someone she didn't recognize. A man she had never seen inside Harlow Creek Medical Center, in a charcoal suit, with the kind of stillness that didn't belong to hospital administration. He looked at Callahan. He looked at the hallway. He looked at Senna. And he took out his phone and made a call without once breaking eye contact with her. Her blood went cold. Hale hadn't come here for Renata Fowler. He'd come here to confirm that Senna was inside the building. She didn't look away from him. The man in the charcoal suit held the phone to his ear and kept his eyes on her and said something she couldn't hear across the length of the hallway, and she understood. The way you understand things that arrive as physical sensation before they arrive as thought. That she had walked into something she hadn't fully mapped. Hale had known she was here, which meant someone had told him, which meant the fracture she'd identified, the anonymous caller, the warning, the voice that had said they already know where you keep things, was not a fracture inside the protection around Hale. It was something else, something she'd been reading wrong. Her phone was in her hand. She looked down at it and made the fastest decision she'd made in a week. She forwarded everything, every email, every document, Dale's pharmacy note, the plaintiff analysis, all of it, to 3 separate addresses simultaneously. Dolores, her brother. And an address she'd set up that morning as a contingency, accessible from a device she'd left with Margot Sills with the instruction to open it if she didn't call by midnight. It was 11:47 p.m. She called Margot. Don't open it yet, she said when Margot picked up. But stay awake. She hung up. The man in the charcoal suit finished his call. He put his phone in his breast pocket and walked toward her with the unhurried certainty of someone who had decided that the direct approach was the most efficient one. He stopped 6 feet away. Ms. Voss, he said, my name is Preston Arlo. I represent the board of directors of Harlow Creek Medical Center. He said it the way lawyers said things when they'd been hired to say them, smooth, not warm, precisely calibrated to sound like information rather than threat. I'd like to speak with you somewhere private. I'm in the middle of giving a statement, she said. The investigators will wait. He smiled, just barely, the smile of a man for whom patience was a tactic. This won't take long. Everything I have to say, she said, I'm going to say with my attorney present. Of course. He nodded, as if this was entirely reasonable, which it was, and he knew it. I simply want you to understand before that conversation happens, that the board is aware of the situation and is taking it with full seriousness. Dr. Hale's actions were not sanctioned by the hospital's leadership, and the board intends to cooperate fully with any investigation. She looked at him. Roy Callahan was in that HR meeting, she said. The one where a terminated employee sat across from the physician she'd accused in a room run by hospital legal. That's not a rogue surgeon, that's a system. Preston Arlo's smile didn't change. Those are exactly the kinds of concerns the board is committed to examining. They're committed now, she said, at 11:50 p.m. with two state investigators down the hall. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost respect. The cold, professional kind, the kind that cost him nothing. Ms. Voss, he said, the board would like to discuss a resolution that's fair to everyone. Talk to my attorney, she said. She walked past him toward the investigators. She gave her statement in a small conference room on the third floor that smelled like old carpet and hand sanitizer, with Dolores on speakerphone and Agent Delmont across the table and a recorder running. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. She was thorough and sequential, and she answered every question completely and asked for clarification twice when the questions weren't precise enough because she was not going to get this wrong. Agent Delmont was good. She didn't lead, didn't fill silences, didn't react visibly when Senna described the slap or the apartment or the plaintiff pattern. She just listened and made occasional brief notes on a legal pad in handwriting so small Senna couldn't read it across the table. When it was over, Delmont clicked off the recorder and said, "The pharmacist, Dale Renfro." "Yes," Senna said. "We'll need him tomorrow." "He knows," Senna said. "He's been waiting to be asked." Delmont looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained something beneath it. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. "You built this in a week," she said, "without access to the building, without institutional support, while being actively interfered with." "I had help," Senna said. "The pharmacy source, the retired nurse, your attorney, and a 26-year-old who was scared and showed up anyway," Senna said. "Don't forget her." Delmont nodded once. "We won't." Senna drove to Nolan's at 2:30 a.m. and slept 5 hours and woke up and ate toast because her body needed something and she'd forgotten to eat since noon. The next 72 hours had the particular quality of aftermath, the thing nobody told you about crisis resolution, which was that it didn't feel like resolution. It felt like paperwork and waiting and the specific grinding fatigue of a process that had momentum now but would not move fast enough for anyone who understood what was at stake. Marcus Hale was formally detained for questioning the morning after the cardiac unit confrontation. He was not yet charged. That came later. But his hospital privileges were suspended pending investigation, a fact that was communicated to staff by Victor Strell in a memo that used the phrase "out of an abundance of caution" 4 times and did not mention Senna Voss at all. Dale Renfro met with investigators on Thursday. He brought documentation going back 8 months, a systematic, careful record of anomalous medication orders that he'd been building with the quiet, precise discipline of a man who trusted process over instinct and had apparently decided months ago the process was going to have to be enough. When he came out of the interview, he called Senna from the parking lot. "They're going to pull the full pharmacy audit," he said. "Everything Hale ordered in the last 3 years." "How long will that take?" she said. "Weeks. Maybe more." He paused. "But they found something faster. The system logs, the actual server logs, not just the terminal records. IT forensics pulled them this morning. They show the access to Gerald Morrow's chart from Terminal 4C happening from a remote session. Someone logged in remotely using Hale's credentials through an authorized external connection. Which means someone gave them his credentials, she said. Or someone stole them, Dale said. Either way, there's a digital trail. And it doesn't end with Hale. She held that for a moment. Who else had access to his credentials? She said. That's the question they're asking now. She thanked him. She sat with what he'd told her and felt the case expanding again, the way it had kept expanding every time she thought she'd found its edges. Another layer, another person, another piece of infrastructure that had made this possible. Dolores called an hour later with the same thread from a different angle. The state health authority had requested a full audit of Harlow Creek's billing records going back 4 years, which was a longer window than the fraud lawsuit had covered, which meant they were expecting to find more. The sealed settlement, Senna said. The court is reviewing whether the sealing should be vacated given the criminal investigation, Dolores said. If it is, the plaintiff depositions become accessible. Thomas Rue, Senna said. Gerald Morrow's brother-in-law. the surviving plaintiff whose connection to Morrow's death had started her down this specific thread. Among others, Dolores said, Senna, I need you to understand that what you've built here is real. The evidence is solid, but the criminal case is in the hands of investigators now, and our role becomes something different. What role? She said. Witness, Dolores said. And then, when we're ready, plaintiff. The word settled differently than she expected. She'd spent so long thinking about the evidence, the documentation, the next step, the immediate threat. She hadn't thought about what came after the immediate threat was over. What came after was slower and required a different kind of endurance. Okay, she said, tell me what that looks like. The first public crack appeared on Friday morning, 6 days after the cardiac unit confrontation. The state health authority issued a formal statement confirming that Harlow Creek Medical Center was under investigation for, and the language was specific, suspected violations of patient safety protocols, medical records integrity standards, and potential criminal misconduct by named hospital personnel. The statement did not name Hale publicly, that came later, but it named the hospital, and it mentioned a multi-patient review spanning 18 months, and by Friday afternoon the statement had been picked up by 3 regional news outlets. Victor Strell issued a response at 4 p.m. It was 4 paragraphs long and contained nothing except the phrase, "We are fully cooperating," and various synonyms of it. Roy Callahan's response was different. He hired his own attorney by Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon had formally indicated to investigators that he was willing to discuss what he knew about administrative decisions made regarding Senna Voss's termination and the HR meeting that preceded it. Senna heard about this from Dolores, who heard about it from Iris Vander, who heard about it from the investigative team. The chain of information was long and filtered, and by the time it reached Senna, it came with appropriate uncertainty. But the substance held. Callahan was cooperating, which meant Callahan was calculating that whatever he could offer investigators was worth more than whatever he'd been protecting. She thought about that, about the calculus of it. The moment when an institution's scaffolding started to load bear differently, when the people inside it began doing the individual math and realizing that collective protection only worked when everyone was doing it simultaneously. She wasn't sure what she felt about Callahan cooperating. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not forgiveness. Something more complicated. The recognition that people inside bad systems weren't always the same as the bad systems themselves, and that the distinction mattered even when it was uncomfortable. Preston Arlo called Dolores on Friday afternoon with a settlement conversation opener. Dolores called Senna immediately after. They want to talk, Dolores said. The board is separating itself from Hale formally and positioning the institution as a secondary victim of a rogue physician. They want to negotiate. What are they offering? Senna said. They haven't gotten to specifics. They're testing whether we'll talk at all. What do you recommend? Senna said. I recommend, Dolores said carefully, that we listen, not agree. Listen, because what they offer at this stage tells us how much they think they're exposed. And then, Senna said, and then we tell them what we actually want. What Senna wanted was not nothing. She'd spent some time in the quiet hours figuring that out. What she would ask for if asking became possible. What resolution looked like to her. What she would need in order to walk away from this feeling. Like the patients who'd died had been answered for in some way she could live with. What she wanted was not the money, though Dolores had made clear that a wrongful termination and civil claim had real value and she shouldn't dismiss it. What she wanted was structural. Changes inside Harlow Creek that were binding and verifiable. An independent patient safety oversight body with actual authority. Nurse reporting protections that were enforceable rather than theoretical. And a public accounting of what had happened that didn't hide behind the word complications. She told Dolores. Dolores wrote it down. The criminal case is separate, Dolores said. We don't control that. Hale is going to face what the evidence says he faces. But on the civil side, what you're describing, it's achievable. Not easy, but achievable. Is it the right move? Senna said. Settlement versus full litigation. Full litigation takes years, Dolores said. It's expensive, it's exhausting, it's publicly visible, which has value, but so does a settlement with teeth, binding consent decree, public statement of findings, structural reforms that are court enforceable. She paused. I'm not going to tell you which one to choose, but I want you to know that getting what you're describing through a negotiated settlement, if we can get it, may actually do more for the next Senna Voss at the next hospital than winning a verdict in 3 years. She thought about that for a long time after she hung up. She thought about Jory Tull in the hallway at the nurse's station, reaching for a phone in the middle of the night to report something she was afraid to report. She thought about Dale Renfro on a park bench feeding pieces of granola bar to an uninterested pigeon, 8 months of documentation sitting in his phone's camera roll because he'd never had someone ask him for it before. She thought about Petra Samuels leaving Harlow Creek 2 years ago for reasons she wouldn't say over the phone. She thought about Gerald Morrow, who had been recovering, whose discharge was planned for Thursday, who had been somebody's husband and somebody's father-in-law, and somebody's connection to a lawsuit that threatened a scheme he probably didn't even fully know he was connected to. She thought, the people who didn't get an ending need the structural changes more than they need the verdict. She called Dolores back. Set up the meeting, she said, but I want one thing in writing before we sit down. What thing? A public statement of findings, she said, not investigation language, not allegations, not potential concerns. A factual statement that patients at Harlow Creek Medical Center were harmed by deliberate action, and that the hospital's administrative structure failed to prevent or respond to it. That goes in writing before we discuss anything else. Dolores was quiet for a moment. That's going to make them uncomfortable, she said. Good, Senna said. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Before it happened, 2 things occurred that changed the shape of everything. The first, the state health authority's billing audit, barely a week in, surfaced a pattern significant enough that the investigation formally expanded to include the state attorney general's office. The fraud wasn't confined to the 18 months the lawsuit had covered. It went back 6 years. The number of patients whose bills had been systematically inflated, procedures they hadn't needed, procedures they hadn't received, procedures that existed only as line items that fed into a revenue structure that had funded, among other things, Marcus Hale's research program, was not 11. It was closer to 300. Dolores called Senna when she got that number. 300, Senna said. Estimated preliminary, could be more. She sat with that. 300 people who had paid or whose insurance had paid or who were still paying for something that had never happened. Against which 6 people, that was the current count, 4 confirmed, 2 under review, had been killed to keep the number from being discovered. The scale of it was the thing that caught her. She'd known she was inside something larger than 1 doctor and 1 dead patient. She hadn't known the full dimensions of what she'd walked into that night in room 9 when Gerald Morrow's IV was running wrong. The second thing, Thomas Rue called her. Not through lawyers, not through intermediaries. Her cell number, her regular cell, the one she'd had for years. And a voice that was tired and deliberate and clearly belonged to someone who had been preparing what he was going to say. My name is Thomas Rue, he said. Gerald Morrow was my wife's brother. I know, she said. I'm sorry. I've been told investigators are building a case. He paused. I was told you're the one who started it. I just did my job, she said, and then felt the inadequacy of that sentence and stopped. I need you to know something, Thomas Rue said. Gerald didn't know anything about our lawsuit. My wife and I never told him. We didn't want to worry him. A pause, longer this time. He was in that hospital for a gallbladder surgery. He had no idea his name was anywhere near anything we were involved in. I know, she said. I want to make sure somebody knows that, he said. He wasn't a target because of something he did. He was a target because of who his sister married. His voice was steady, but something in it kept almost not being steady and then pulling itself back. I need that to be part of the record. It will be, she said. I'll make sure. She meant it. She wrote it down. Not in the case file, not in a document for investigators, but in her own handwriting in the notebook she'd been carrying since the beginning. Thomas Rue's name. Gerald Morrow's name. The specific injustice of a man who hadn't known he was a variable in someone else's equation. She would carry that into the Wednesday meeting. The Wednesday meeting took place in a conference room at Dolores's law office, neutral ground, which Dolores had insisted on, and which Preston Arlo had conceded without much resistance, which told Senna something about how the board had recalibrated since Friday's news coverage. The board sent Arlo and 2 other attorneys and a woman named Sylvia Merchant, who was identified as the board's newly appointed interim oversight chair, a title that hadn't existed at Harlow Creek 7 days ago. Dolores opened by placing a single sheet of paper on the table. It was the draft public statement of findings, One page, factual, no hedging language. Preston Arlo looked at it. He looked at Sylvia Merchant. He said nothing for a moment. "This is unusually direct," he said. "It's accurate," Dolores said, "which is the only standard we're working from." Arlo picked it up and read it fully, which took about 90 seconds. He set it down. He made a small notation on his own notepad. "We can work with this," he said. Senna had expected the fight to be here, on this point, on the language, on the precision of what the hospital admitted in writing. She'd expected this to be where they held the line for 2 hours while lawyers negotiated synonyms. It took 11 minutes. She didn't know whether to read that as a victory or a sign that they'd already decided to give this ground in order to hold something else. She kept her face even and stayed quiet and let Dolores work. What came next was 3 hours of the detailed, grinding, repetitive work of negotiation. Structural reforms, oversight mechanisms, reporting protections, compensation structures. Senna spoke when Dolores asked her to speak and stayed silent, when silence was the right tool, and there were moments when the conversation went into legal and procedural territory. She wasn't trained to follow, and she had to trust that Dolores was tracking it. At one point, Sylvia Merchant looked at her directly and said, "What do you actually want from this, Ms. Voss? Not legally, personally." The question landed differently than she expected. Maybe because it was the first time someone from the hospital side had asked it. Maybe because Merchant had been watching her for 3 hours with the specific attention of someone trying to understand rather than manage. "I want the next nurse who finds something wrong to have a system that doesn't punish them for reporting it," Senna said. "I want the next patient who gets admitted for a gallbladder surgery to go home on Thursday the way he was supposed to. That's it. That's the whole thing." Merchant nodded. She didn't say anything empty. She just nodded. The meeting broke at 4:47 p.m. without a final agreement, but with a framework, terms to be drafted, reviewed, pushed back against, revised. The normal pace of the law, which was slower than everything but more durable than most. Outside on the sidewalk after, Dolores said, "That was better than I expected." "Was it enough?" Senna said. "It's a start." Dolores gathered her bag. The criminal case moves on its own track. Hale is still in front of investigators. The AG's office is in the billing records. That doesn't depend on what we negotiate. "What's the timeline on charges?" Senna said. "Weeks, probably. These cases are built to hold. They won't move until they're sure." She looked at Senna. "Are you sleeping?" "Some." "You need to sleep." She said it like a prescription. "You've been running on threat response for 2 weeks. The acute phase is over." Senna looked at the sidewalk. The afternoon was cooling, the city doing what it did at 5 o'clock. People moving with purpose, half of them on phones, the particular energy of a workday releasing into early evening. "Someone called me," she said, "that first night, anonymous. She told me Renata Fowler was next." "You mentioned that." "I never found out who it was." Dolores paused. "Does it matter now?" "I don't know," Senna said. "It might. If she was inside the hospital, then the investigators will find her," Dolores said. "That's their work now. Let them do it." She drove back through the city in the early evening traffic and thought about that. The anonymous voice, the careful, deliberate sentences, the specific cadence of someone who decided to do something they couldn't fully explain. She'd been carrying that question alongside everything else, not because it changed the case, but because it felt unfinished. A person had called her in the middle of the night and told her the truth, and then disappeared back into whatever circumstance had made that call both necessary and dangerous. She wanted to know who that was. She was still thinking about it when she got to Nolan's and found him standing in the kitchen with his phone out and an expression on his face that was different from the worried but managing expression he'd been wearing for 2 weeks. "Someone called the landline," he said. He only had the landline because their mother had insisted years ago, and he'd never gotten around to canceling it. "About an hour ago, she said she was trying to reach you and that she'd found your brother's number through the pharmacist." Senna went still. "What did she say?" "She said—" He looked at the notepad he'd written on. "She said to tell you that the reason she couldn't call back was that she was inside the investigation. She said she's been working with the state health authority for 4 months. She said she's the one who told them Senna Voss was worth listening to." He handed her the notepad. There was a name at the bottom, not a name she recognized. A woman named Vera Colum, who had worked in Harlow Creek's compliance department for 3 years and had left 8 months ago. Left, Senna would find out later, because she'd taken what she'd found internally to the state health authority and been told to step back and let the investigation develop without tipping off the hospital that someone inside was feeding information. Vera Colum had been the anonymous voice. Vera Colum had been feeding the health authority evidence for 4 months before Senna had ever walked into Trauma Bay 2. She stood in Nolan's kitchen holding the notepad and understood that she hadn't started this case alone and hadn't ended it alone, and that the architecture of the thing was larger than she'd known, that other people had been inside it, in their own ways, building from their own angles, all of them invisible to each other until the moment when the structure was solid enough to show. She was still standing there when her phone rang again. Not Dolores. Not Nolan's number. A number she recognized this time, Agent Delmont's direct line. She answered. "Ms. Voss," Delmont said, "I wanted to make sure you heard this from us before it becomes public." A brief pause. "Marcus Hale will be formally charged tomorrow morning. 3 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of evidence, and abuse of a position of medical authority. The arrest warrant was signed an hour ago." Senna sat down on the kitchen chair. "Okay," she said. "There's one more thing," Delmont said. "The IT forensics team finished their analysis of the remote access sessions, the credentials that were used to access Gerald Morrow's chart from Terminal 4C. They were accessed remotely through an account registered to the hospital's network, but flagged as belonging to Victor Strel." She went very still. "The hospital director," she said. "His account credentials," Delmont said. "We're not confirming whether he used them personally or whether they were used without his knowledge. But his office is being searched tomorrow at the same time as the arrest. And I want you to be aware—" Another pause, deliberate. "We found a name in his files. A patient. Someone currently admitted to Harlow Creek under a false name, recovered from a procedure 3 weeks ago, who has been, according to his own handwritten notes, a liability since October." "Who?" Senna said. "His name is Elliot Bray," Delmont said. "He's a former Harlow Creek financial administrator. He was in the building the night the fraud scheme was set up, and based on what we've found in Strel's files, he's been talking to a federal contact for the past 6 weeks." She was quiet. "You're telling me there's a witness," she said, "inside the hospital right now." "We've had 2 agents on his floor since this morning," Delmont said. "He's secure." "What does he have?" she said. "Ms. Voss," Delmont said, and the professionalism in her voice had something else under it now, something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. "He has records, physical records, paper, not digital, spanning 6 years. He kept them because he knew at some point he was going to need them." The kitchen was very quiet around Senna. 6 years. Paper records. A man admitted under a false name to a hospital floor 2 agents were watching, who had carried evidence in his own hands through 6 years of deciding whether the moment had come. "He's been waiting for someone to break it open from the outside," she said. It wasn't really a question. "That appears to be the case," Delmont said. She sat with that. The weight of it. The way a thing like this existed. Layers of people holding different pieces, waiting for the conditions that made releasing them survivable. Vera Colum, in compliance. Dale Renfrow in the pharmacy. Jory Tull in the hallway. Thomas Rue on the phone. And somewhere in a hospital room under a name that wasn't his, Elliot Bray, with a folder full of paper that covered 6 years of a scheme that had killed people. All of them waiting for someone to walk into Trauma Bay 2 and refuse to drop the file. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "We'll be in touch about tomorrow," Delmont said. "Try to get some sleep." She hung up. Nolan was watching her from across the kitchen. "What?" he said. She set the phone down. She looked at her hands for a moment, the hands she'd used to photograph a medication bag at 2 a.m., to copy files, to write dates and names in a notebook, to hold a patient file against her chest, while a man's palm left a mark on her face. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "It was always bigger than I thought." "Is that good?" he said. She thought about Elliot Bray in a hospital room with 6 years of paper. "It means the case holds," she said. "It means it doesn't come down to one nurse's photographs." She stopped. "It means he can't make me the story anymore." Nolan nodded slowly. He turned back to the stove. He'd been making something Some ordinary dinner, the kind of ordinary thing that had kept happening in the background of all of this. And she sat at his kitchen table and felt the last 2 weeks settle into her like weight, like something she'd been holding at arm's length that was now allowed to be heavy. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed one more time. A text. Unknown number. Different from the one before. 3 words. Room 312. Tonight. Her stomach dropped. Renata Fowler was in room 312. The agents were on Elliot Bray's floor. The arrest warrant was for tomorrow. And someone had just told her to be in a specific room at a specific hospital, tonight, without any context, without any explanation, from a number that would disappear before she could call it back. She looked at the text for a long moment. Then she stood up, put her jacket on, and picked up her keys. Nolan said her name once, from the kitchen, and she didn't stop. She was in the car before she'd fully decided to go, which was probably the most honest thing she'd done in a week, moving before the careful, rational part of her brain could build the argument against it. She called Dolores from the car. Dolores didn't answer. She left a message. Room 312 Harlow Creek, unknown contact. Tonight, I'm going in. Then she called Agent Delmont. Delmont picked up on the second ring. I just got a text, Senna said. Unknown number, room 312. Tonight. That's Renata Fowler's room. A pause. We have 2 agents on the 4th floor with Bray. Cardiac unit wasn't flagged. I know. Ms. Voss, do not go into that building alone. I'm already driving, she said. Someone is trying to tell me something, and I've learned to pay attention to that. Give me 10 minutes, Delmont said. I'll have someone at the cardiac unit entrance. I don't have 10 minutes if something is already happening. She heard Delmont make a decision, the sound of someone recalculating risk in real time. Go in through the ER. Don't interact with anyone you don't recognize. I'll have an agent there in 8. She drove. The ER waiting room had thinned out from the last time. 3 people now instead of 6, different faces, the same specific quality of exhausted endurance that waiting rooms produced. She moved through it the way she'd moved through it before, purposeful and unremarkable, and took the stairs. 3rd floor. Cardiac unit. South wing. The hallway was quiet. Night shift quiet. The kind that felt like held breath. The nurse's station was occupied by one person she didn't know, a night nurse who looked up briefly when she turned the corner and then looked back down at a monitor. Senna moved toward room 312. The door was open. She stopped at the threshold and looked in and found Renata Fowler sitting up in her bed. Not asleep, not alarmed, but sitting up with the particular alertness of someone who had been waiting. And beside her, in the chair that visitors used, a small woman in her mid-60s with close-cropped gray hair and the specific steady composure of someone who had already made peace with whatever came next. The woman looked at Senna. You're her, she said. Not a question. I'm Senna Voss, she said. I know who you are. The woman glanced at Renata Fowler, something passing between them, the shorthand of people who'd been talking for a while. My name is Vera Colum. Senna stood in the doorway and looked at the woman whose voice she'd heard once on a phone at midnight and never expected to see. You came here yourself, Senna said. I needed to see that she was all right, Vera said. She looked at Renata Fowler with the expression of someone who carried responsibility for another person's safety and had not yet put it down. I've known Renata for 2 years. She came to me when she found out her daughter was in the lawsuit. A pause. I didn't know they'd put her in this hospital. I didn't find out until 3 days ago. Why didn't you call me directly then? Senna said. Because I'm still technically an active witness in the health authority investigation, and direct contact with you has to go through channels. Vera looked at her evenly. I bent that rule tonight. I'm not going to apologize for it. Senna stepped into the room. She pulled the second chair, the one against the wall that nobody ever used, up to the other side of the bed and sat down. Renata Fowler had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of a woman who understood that her room had become the center of something much larger than her cardiac workup, and who had decided to let it be so. Nobody told me any of this, Renata said. About Greta's case, about what was happening in this hospital. She said it without accusation, stating a fact, processing it. I've been here 4 days for a stress test. You're okay, Senna said. The medication order on your chart was flagged and blocked before it was administered. You're not in danger tonight. Renata looked at her for a moment. Because of you, she said. Because of several people, Senna said. They sat in the room, the three of them, a fired nurse, a former compliance officer, and a 67-year-old woman who had come in for a routine procedure and ended up at the intersection of something that had been building for 6 years. And Vera told her the rest of it. She'd worked in Harlow Creek's compliance department for 3 years. She'd started seeing anomalies in the billing records in her first year. Small things. The kind that could be chalked up to coding errors if you were inclined to chalk them up to coding errors. She wasn't so inclined. She started documenting. She brought her documentation to Victor Strell's office 18 months in, at which point she was thanked for her diligence and told the discrepancies were under internal review. 3 months later, she was told her position was being restructured. She didn't go quietly. She went to the state health authority with what she had, which was significant but not complete. Enough to open a preliminary inquiry, not enough to move. And then she spent the next 8 months as a careful, invisible conduit, passing what she found through appropriate channels, watching the investigation grow, and waiting for the moment when someone inside the hospital would break the surface from a different angle and make the whole thing undeniable. You needed someone they couldn't dismiss as disgruntled, Senna said. I needed someone with clinical credibility and documented evidence of active patient harm, Vera said. Someone who would make the health authority move faster than bureaucracy usually moves. She looked at Senna. When you filed the assault report and the incident report in the same week, I called Iris Vander and told her it was time. Senna thought about that. About the call Dolores had made, the way Iris Vander had been responsive in a way that Dolores had found slightly surprising for a government official at midnight. She hadn't been surprised. She'd been waiting. You should have told me, Senna said. I know, Vera said. I'm sorry. The investigation's legal requirements. I understand the requirements, Senna said. I still wish you'd told me. Vera nodded. She accepted that without deflection. They sat for another few minutes, and then Senna heard footsteps in the hallway. Agent Delmont's backup, arriving 7 minutes later than promised, which was actually pretty good. She stepped out and identified herself and answered the questions she needed to answer, and then came back to the doorway of 312 and looked at Vera Colum. Go home, she said. You've been in this building long enough. Vera stood. She squeezed Renata Fowler's hand once, efficient and warm at the same time. At the door, she stopped. For what it's worth, she said, I've spent 2 years on this. I know every document, every date, every number. She looked at Senna. I've never been able to explain to anyone why it mattered, what it actually cost, the way you can. Because I had patience, Senna said. Yes, Vera said. That's exactly why. She left. Senna stood at the threshold of room 312 for a moment longer and looked at Renata Fowler, who was watching her with tired, clear eyes. Will my daughter be all right? Renata said. With all of this. The lawsuit is going to be vacated, Senna said. The sealing order will come down. Whatever your daughter was trying to do, it's going to matter more now than it would have at trial. Renata nodded slowly. Good, she said. And then quietly, you should go home too. You look like you haven't slept in a week. About that, Senna said. She drove back through the city at close to midnight, and for the first time in 2 weeks the drive felt different. Not surveillance aware, not calculating the next step, just a drive through a city at night, the particular amber and dark of streetlights and empty intersections, and the distant red of a traffic light going through its cycle for nobody. She went to Nolan's. I was still awake, reading at the kitchen table in a way that suggested he'd been not sleeping while pretending to read. He looked up. He looked at her face. It's okay, she said. Go to sleep. He did. She sat at the table for another hour and wrote, not documentation, not case notes, just wrote, in the same notebook she'd been carrying since the beginning, about Gerald Morrow and what it felt like to stand in room 9 at 2 a.m. and know something was wrong and choose to stay with what she knew instead of walking past it. About the weight of that choice and the cost of it and why she would make it again. She wrote until the words ran out. Then she went to sleep. Marcus Hale was arrested at 7:14 the following morning. 2 agents met him in the parking structure of his residential building as he was leaving for what he apparently intended to be an ordinary day, his hospital privileges suspended, but his freedom still intact, until that morning when it stopped being intact. Senna didn't watch it happen. She heard about it from Delmont at 7:52. A brief call, professional and factual. Arrest executed, processing underway, formal charges to be filed by noon. Victor Strel was served with a search warrant at the same time. He was not immediately arrested. The evidence connecting him to the remote access sessions was solid, but the question of personal involvement versus credential theft was still under active investigation. But by that afternoon, he had placed himself on administrative leave, and his attorney had issued a statement that contained the phrase full cooperation in its first sentence. Roy Callahan had been cooperating for 3 days already. His attorney negotiated the terms of that cooperation through channels that Dolores tracked without involving Senna directly, because some things were better processed at a distance. The formal charges against Hale were released at 12:07 p.m. Senna was sitting in Dolores's office when they came through, not because she needed to be there, but because she didn't want to be alone when she read them. 3 counts of murder in the second degree, 2 counts of attempted murder. Conspiracy to commit fraud, spanning 6 years, involving systematic overbilling of patient accounts in excess of $4 million. Obstruction of justice, destruction of medical evidence, falsification of patient records, abuse of medical authority. She read the list twice. Second degree, she said. Premeditation is harder to establish than you'd think, Dolores said. The prosecution will push for first. His defense will argue the deaths were intended as undetectable complications, which is a strange technical argument that unfortunately has some precedent. She paused. He's not walking away from this, Senna. Not from 7 counts. She knew that. She'd known it since Delmont's call the night before. Knowing it and feeling it land were different. Elliot Bray, she said. 6 years of financial records. Paper, not digital, which means they can't argue data manipulation. He'll be the prosecution's anchor witness. Dolores looked at her steadily. Hale's attorney is already signaling a negotiated plea on the fraud charges in exchange for cooperation on identifying other parties involved. The prosecution hasn't responded yet. He'll try to reduce the murder charges through cooperation, Senna said. He'll try. Will it work? Dolores was quiet for a moment. The prosecution has Bray's records, the pharmacy documentation, the IT forensics on the remote sessions, your photographs, and a pharmacist who documented anomalous orders for 8 months. They don't need Hale's cooperation as badly as his attorneys think they do. She met Senna's eyes. I think he's going to trial, and I think he's going to lose. Senna sat with that. The particular complicated weight of justice that was real but slow, that would take months in a courtroom and a jury and everything that entailed before it was final. Gerald Morrow deserved better than 18 months of waiting for a verdict, she said. Yes, Dolores said simply. He did. There wasn't anything to add to that. They both knew it and sat with it and then moved forward, because forward was the only direction the work went. The public statement from Harlow Creek's board was released that same afternoon. It was a full page. It used the specific language Senna had required. Not allegations, not potential concerns, but a factual acknowledgement that patients at Harlow Creek Medical Center had been subjected to deliberate harm, that administrative structures had failed to prevent or respond to that harm, and that a member of the nursing staff who had identified and reported those failures had been wrongfully terminated and subjected to physical assault that the institution had failed to adequately address. It named Senna Voss, not in a lawsuit context, not in a legal filing, in a public statement attached to the hospital's name, readable by anyone. She read it 3 times, not because she needed to verify the language. Dolores had negotiated every word, but because she'd spent 2 weeks inside a narrative where her name was attached to misconduct and fabrication and criminal complaint, and the experience of seeing it attached to something true and factual required more than one pass to settle. Her phone started ringing that afternoon and didn't stop. Former colleagues, some of whom had stood in Trauma Bay too and said nothing. Reporters, which she didn't answer and referred to Dolores. Petra Samuels, who called from her county health office and said simply, I knew you'd get there. I just didn't know how long it would take. Dale Renfro, who texted rather than called. They offered me witness protection, turned it down, figured I'd stick around and actually see this through. She laughed at that one, briefly and genuinely, which surprised her. Jory Toll sent a message at 9 p.m. I've been thinking about what you said that morning in the coffee shop, that you just needed to know you weren't alone in what you saw. A pause, then another message. I think I needed to know that too. Senna held the phone and thought about that. The way other people's courage worked, how it didn't come fully formed but in stages, how showing up for the small version of a thing sometimes made the larger version possible. Jory at the nurse's station with her hand on the phone. Dale on a park bench, deciding. Vera Colm at a state health office, making a call 18 months before Senna ever walked into room 9. None of them had done the same thing. All of them had done the necessary thing. She typed back, "You weren't." The civil settlement was finalized 6 weeks later. The terms were not simple and were not cheap and required 11 rounds of negotiation that tested Dolores's patience in ways she expressed professionally and Senna's patience in ways she expressed mostly to Nolan's kitchen ceiling at 1 in the morning. But they held. The structural reforms were binding and court enforceable. An independent patient safety oversight board with external members, no hospital-employed majority, quarterly reporting requirements, and a mandate to review any adverse patient event within 48 hours. A nurse reporting protection clause that made retaliation a breach of the settlement agreement, triggering automatic financial penalties. A mandatory ethics review process for any senior medical staff complaint that required external, not internal, investigation. Compensation for the families of the 4 confirmed victims, Gerald Morrow among them, was negotiated separately and confidentially, at amounts that no dollar figure could make adequate, and that everyone involved understood as inadequate and necessary at the same time. The part of the settlement that mattered most to Senna, in a way that was harder to explain than the structural provisions, was the provision requiring Harlow Creek to establish and fund an annual patient safety forum, an open event, publicly accessible, at which nurses, aides, and ancillary staff could present concerns directly to the oversight board without administrative intermediaries. It had been her idea. Dolores had looked at her when she proposed it, and then written it down without comment. She thought about what Sylvia Merchant had asked her. "What do you actually want from this, Ms. Voss?" That. That was what she wanted. A room where the person who noticed something wrong didn't have to first calculate whether the noticing would cost them more than the wrong they were noticing. She signed the settlement on a Thursday. She and Dolores shook hands, which felt insufficient given everything but was what the moment offered, and then Senna drove back through the city and stopped for coffee. She actually tasted this time, at a place she'd been going to since before she started at Harlow Creek 9 years ago, and sat in the window for half an hour watching people walk by. In the ordinary way that people walked by places they didn't know contained anything significant. She thought about what she was going to do next. The offer came from the state health authority, not from Harlow Creek. Iris Vander called her directly, not through Dolores, not through channels, a direct call on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the settlement. She wanted to know if Senna would be interested in a newly created position within the authority's medical oversight division, a clinical consultant role focused on developing nurse-led patient safety protocols for mid-sized regional hospitals, drawing on her direct experience to build the kind of reporting infrastructure that would make another Harlow Creek harder to sustain and easier to detect. It was not a glamorous position. It involved a lot of meetings and draft documents and the specific grind of trying to change institutional behavior through policy, which was slower and less satisfying than the direct clinical work of nursing and required a different kind of endurance. She asked for a week to think about it. She used the week to do something she hadn't done in months, which was work a shift. Not at Harlow Creek, but at a community clinic on the east side of the city where Margot Sills had connections, and where they were short-staffed on Saturdays. She worked 8 hours. She triaged, administered, monitored, documented. She talked to 4 patients in the way she'd always talked to patients, which was directly and without condescension, treating their specific experience of their specific body as the most authoritative information in the room. At the end of the shift, she sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long, and a nurse she'd worked beside all day. A woman named Frances, who was in her 50s and had the calm, slightly sardonic quality of someone who had seen everything and chosen to stay, sat down across from her. "You're the nurse from Harlow Creek," Frances said. "Yes," Senna said. Frances looked at her for a moment. "I read about what you found, what they did to you." A pause. "I've been a nurse for 22 years. I've seen 3 situations like yours." "What happened?" Senna said. "2 nurses left the profession," Frances said. One transferred hospitals and never reported. She wrapped both hands around her mug. None of them had the evidence you had, but I've thought about it a lot, whether that was really the difference, or whether the difference was something else. What do you think? Senna said. Francis looked at her steadily. I think you refuse to believe that being right wasn't enough. Most people, when the institution turns on them, they start wondering if they were wrong. Even when they know they weren't, the doubt gets in. She set down the mug. You didn't let the doubt in. That's not normal. Senna thought about that. It got in, she said. Late at night it got in. I just didn't let it make decisions. Francis nodded slowly. That's the thing, I suppose, she said. You can be afraid and still move. They sat with that for a moment. What are you doing next? Francis said. Senna told her about Iris Vander's offer. Francis was quiet while she talked. When Senna finished, she said, Policy work is slow. I know. It'll feel nothing like this. I know that too. But if it works, Francis said, if the systems you build actually hold, you'll never know how many rooms you didn't have to walk into at 2 a.m. because the thing got caught earlier. She paused. That's a strange kind of accomplishment. Invisible. I'm comfortable being invisible, Senna said. Francis smiled for the first time all day. Yeah, she said, I could tell. She called Iris Vander the next morning and said yes. Marcus Hale's trial began 4 months after his arrest. It lasted 3 weeks. Senna testified on the 7th day, 2 hours on direct, 90 minutes of cross-examination from a defense attorney who was skilled and thorough and who spent most of his time trying to establish that her evidence was incomplete, her interpretation beyond her clinical expertise, and her motivation shaped by professional grievance. She answered every question completely. She did not become defensive. She did not become angry. She acknowledged the things she hadn't known when she'd known them, the gaps in her initial documentation, the moments where she'd made assumptions she'd later had to revise. She answered the defense's framing with the same specific factual language she'd been using since the night in room 9. At one point, the defense attorney said, Isn't it true that you had no formal training in medical record forensics? That's correct, she said. So your interpretation of the chart modifications. My interpretation was that a note documenting a risk factor had been removed from a patient's chart between one nursing shift and the next. I didn't need medical record forensics training to know that the note was there on Tuesday and gone on Wednesday. I needed eyes. She paused. I've had eyes for 9 years. The courtroom was quiet. The attorney moved on. Elliot Bray testified on the 11th day. He was on the stand for 6 hours across 2 days, and he walked through 6 years of the fraud scheme in the methodical, paper-documented detail of a man who had spent those 6 years knowing he might eventually have to do exactly this. His records were entered into evidence, physical folders, organized by quarter, covering a scheme that had inflated hospital billing by a total of $4,800,000 and had purchased, among other things, Marcus Hale's expanded research program, 6 of the board members' performance bonuses, and Victor Strell's silence. Strell had been charged separately on 3 counts of conspiracy. He'd pleaded guilty to 2 of them the week before Hale's trial began, in an agreement that secured his testimony and reduced his exposure at the cost of his career, his pension, and whatever remained of his public standing after the agreement's details became court record. He was 61 years old and looked 10 years older on the stand. Senna watched him testify and tried to find something clean in what she felt, something that settled neatly into vindication or satisfaction or righteous finality. She didn't find it. What she found was more complicated. A person who had made choices across years, small and large, that had compounded into the enabling of murders, and who had done so not from malice exactly, but from something more banal, and in some ways worse, the determination to protect the thing he'd built, at whatever cost to whoever bore it. She thought about Gerald Morrow, whose only connection to any of this was his sister's marriage. She thought about the other victims. 4 people confirmed, 2 more under review. The number might not be final. She thought about all of them, and she watched Victor Strell testify, and she didn't forgive him, and she didn't hate him, and she didn't understand fully how someone got from the person they were at the beginning to the person he was now. Maybe nobody could, from the outside. Maybe that was the honest answer. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Marcus Hale was found guilty on all 7 counts. Senna was in the courthouse when the verdict came in. She was sitting in the gallery, not at the plaintiff's table. The criminal case was the state's, not hers, and she heard the foreman say guilty 7 times in the particular flat administrative tone that courtroom procedure required, and each time she felt the word land somewhere different, in different parts of what the last 5 months had cost her. The 7th time, she let out a breath she'd been holding since the moment in Trauma Bay 2, when a sound like something breaking had cut through the air, and 30 people had stood very still and said nothing. She didn't cry. She'd expected she might, and she didn't, which surprised her, and also didn't. Outside the courthouse afterward, Dolores stood beside her in the weak November afternoon light and said, "How are you?" "I don't know yet," Senna said. "Ask me in a month." Dolores nodded. She understood the distinction. They stood for a moment on the courthouse steps. People moved past them. Attorneys, journalists, people who'd been inside for other cases, people walking by on ordinary business who had no idea what had just concluded in a courtroom 2 floors up. "He'll appeal," Dolores said. "I know. It'll probably take years. I know that too. And you're okay with that." Senna looked at the street. A bus went by. A woman walked a dog that was deeply invested in a particular patch of sidewalk. "He's convicted," she said. "That holds while the appeal runs. The records are public. The oversight board starts operating next month. Dale Renfro is still at the pharmacy and now has a direct reporting line to the oversight committee." She paused. "And Jory Toll just got promoted to charge nurse." Dolores looked at her. "Jory deserved it before this," Senna said. "She was always better than the system let her be." "Is that the lesson?" Dolores said. "That people are better than the systems they're in?" Senna thought about it. "I think the lesson is that systems don't notice what they're doing to people until someone makes them notice," she said. "And the people who make them notice usually pay for it before they see any benefit from it." She tucked her hands into her jacket pockets. "That's not a comfortable lesson, but it's the one I have." She walked down the courthouse steps. She had a meeting with Iris Vander on Thursday, the first formal policy working session on the new reporting protocol framework, which would be presented to a consortium of 12 regional hospitals in the spring. She had a Saturday shift at the community clinic she'd agreed to cover monthly, because she was not going to give up the work of being in a room with patients entirely, because that work was where she knew who she was. She had things to do. She wasn't the same person who had walked into room 9 at 2:14 in the morning and found an IV drip running wrong. Not because what had happened had transformed her in some clean, cinematic way, but because 5 months of fighting something that wasn't supposed to be fightable had used up parts of her that didn't grow back exactly the same and built other parts she hadn't had before. She was harder in some places, more patient in others, better at asking for help, which had been a significant weakness she was not embarrassed to acknowledge. She still ran on instinct, and she still got in her own way sometimes, and she still said the direct true thing when the diplomatic pause would have served her better, and she was going to keep doing all of those things because they were hers. She thought about Francis at the community clinic, saying, "You can be afraid and still move." She'd been afraid every day of the last 5 months, afraid of being wrong, afraid of being silenced, afraid of what it meant for the patients who didn't have someone in room 9 at 2 a.m. who refused to let the doubt make decisions. She'd moved anyway, not because she was exceptional. She didn't believe she was exceptional, and she was wary of that story, the story where one extraordinary person goes up against a corrupt system and wins, because it implied that the problem was containable, that it only required the right individual, that ordinary people in ordinary circumstances could afford to stay quiet because someone exceptional would handle it. That wasn't the story. The story was that 6 people had held different pieces of this thing, in a pharmacy, in a compliance office, in a hospital room under a false name, in a coffee shop at 7 a.m. in compression socks, in a small law office in the west of the city, and none of them had been exceptional. They'd just been paying attention and unwilling to stop paying attention when paying attention became expensive. That was available to everyone. It cost the same for everyone, which was to say it cost a great deal, and it was available anyway. She crossed the street at the corner below the courthouse, the ordinary act of a person moving through a city on a November afternoon, and she thought about Gerald Morrow, who had deserved his Thursday discharge and hadn't gotten it, and she carried that the way she was going to carry it, which was quietly and permanently, because some things were not meant to stop being heavy. She walked, and the city moved around her, and somewhere in Harlow Creek Medical Center, the new oversight board's protocols were being drafted, and a charge nurse named Jory Tull was starting her first week in a role she'd earned, and a pharmacist named Dale Renfro was photographing a medication label out of a habit that was now, officially, policy. The woman they'd tried to erase had become the reason those things existed. She hadn't wanted to be that. She'd wanted Gerald Morrow to go home on Thursday. But this was what was left, and it was real, and it mattered, and she was going to do everything she could with it. She kept walking,